What's going on, my fellow rock and rollers? Don't forget to hit the bell notification icon to be notified every time I put out a new video on my channel. If I had to name one of my favorite records of all time, I'd probably have to go with Boston's self-titled debut record. Released in 1976, the album was a massive success, selling over 17 million copies. And it would set the path for what should have been a massive career, but it didn't. 4 years later, the band only released one more album, and they quickly crashed and burned. So what happened? Stay tuned to find out. Tom Scholz was the mastermind behind Boston, an MIT alumni, and following his graduation, he would end up getting a job with Polaroid, working as a product design engineer. Apart from tinkering with electronics, he was also into music, having played in a series of bands in the city of Boston with names like Middle Earth, Freehold, and Mother's Milk. And while he spent a lot of time on the live music circuit, he quickly realized he wasn't going to get a record deal that way. It was then he turned his attention to recording demos in some local studios, which never caught the interest of any record labels. He would soon enough build himself a 12-track recording studio in his basement, and again, record labels showed no interest in what he was creating. It wasn't until he enlisted the help of several musicians he had played with on the local Boston circuit that he finally got the attention of the labels. Guitarist Barry Goudreau, who Scholz played with in Boston on the live music circuit, would introduce him to singer Brad Delp. They worked on and created the songs that formed the first Boston album, albeit some of them with different names. San Francisco Day, which was later renamed to Hitch A Ride, It Isn't Easy, which was retitled Something About You, Foreplay, originally composed in 1969, Peace of Mind, Rock and Roll Band, and the final track they recorded was called 90 Days, which was later renamed More Than a Feeling. The hand claps on the song were even from Scholz's first wife. And you would think these songs would have created a bidding war with the record labels, but they didn't. In fact, most record labels passed on the demos. But in 1975, Tom Scholz was contacted by a representative from ABC Records named Charlie McKenzie. It had turned out by some strange twist of fate, McKenzie had heard the demo while he was visiting a friend who worked at RCA Records. That friend's name was Paul Ahern, and McKenzie and Ahern convinced Scholz to let them shop around the demo, claiming they could get him a record deal. They would end up taking the demo to CBS-owned Epic Records, who showed interest. But prior to signing a deal, they wanted to see the band perform live for executives. Epic staff producer Tom Werman recalled to Classic Rock magazine hearing the demos for the first time, revealing, after More Than a Feeling, which sounded quite like the final product, and halfway through the second song, I stopped the tape. I couldn't believe that this music was actually available to us, and told Ahern that if Lenny and I could see the band reproduce this live, we'd guarantee we'd sign them. As Scholz turned his attention to doing a live showcase for record executives, he didn't really have a band. Scholz would work with Delp, as well as a bunch of local musicians they already knew from the Boston music scene for the live showcase, which took place at a warehouse space which ended up belonging to Aerosmith. The band would pass with flying colors and sign an astounding 10-album deal that would last 6 years. While it may seem crazy, that was a standard contract that was given to bands back then. However, things started to turn sour for Scholz when Epic Records told him that they wanted him to re-record the demos in a studio setting with an experienced producer. The label suggested John Boylan, who met Scholz, where the pair hatched a pretty impressive scheme. Instead of going to LA to re-record the demos, which Scholz thought was pointless, he would stay home in Boston and work in his basement sprucing up the demos to give the record label something that seemed more polished. Meanwhile, the rest of the band would go to Los Angeles to work on new material that would turn into the song Let Me Take You Home Tonight. Scholz stayed home, fastidiously gussying up the demos to give Epic something that sounded like a more polished version, and he would end up striking a deal with Boylan where he got a producer credit as well. The plan worked, and the label was none the wiser. With an album in the can, the band still didn't have a name. It would be the album's producer and his engineer who suggested to use the name Boston, and the name stuck. Released in the summer of 1976, the album was a massive hit, becoming the fastest-selling record of the 70s, helped in large part by the opening track and single More Than a Feeling. More Than a Feeling would be a top 5 hit, and it was enough of a reason for Scholz to quit his job at Polaroid. Now the band had to turn its attention to touring, which saw them open for some pretty big names, including Foghat, Black Sabbath, and Blue Oyster Cult. And while the tour was enjoyable for the group, the record label was hungry for another album. Scholz felt the pressure, but being the perfectionist he was, he felt like it was too soon to record a follow-up. and soon enough Scholz started to work on Boston's sophomore record, 1978's Don't Look Back. And while the record hit #1 on the album charts and sold over 7 million copies, Scholz felt like it was rushed despite the fact that it was delivered a year later than the label wanted. Scholz wanted the freedom to work on the record for as long as he needed, without the pressure of a label, but unfortunately the business doesn't work that way. The tour to support the album was grueling, lasting over 2 years, and during an interview with Third Stage, Scholz revealed, "We had gone on a horrible tour in 1978, 1979. We played Boston songs and I loved playing them on stage, but it was horrible. It was long, and when I got off the road, I wasn't sure that I ever wanted to go on tour again. Brad told me he didn't ever want to go on tour, and I was going to hang it up and just record. I took a little time off after Don't Look Back. I was drained. I was more than drained. I was demoralized. I wasn't sure that I wanted to be in the music business. I didn't like what I had seen. Brad and I had made a lot of money for a lot of people, and I didn't like what they were doing. I began to feel guilty about enabling people to do things that I didn't approve of. I considered leaving music altogether and going back to being an engineer," he'd say. Scholz would end up staying in the music industry and began work on Boston's third album, but he was going to take his time until he was ready to release something new. It was around this time the guitarist realized that his manager, Paul Ahern, had owned a percentage of all the songs that he had written when they first signed their contract in the mid-70s. The manager would be sacked by Scholz, and he would turn around and sue the musician. And burned out by what was going on around him, Scholz convened his band and told them that he was no longer interested in working on music, and they were free to pursue other career ventures. So guitarist Barry Goudreau managed to sign a deal with Epic Records and release a solo album which featured future Boston vocalist Frank Cosmo. The guitarist's solo record was enjoyed by critics, but commercially, it didn't do much. Things would take a turn for the worst when Scholz noticed a billboard that Epic ran, advertising Goudreau's album with the claim, "12 million people know the sound of this guitar. We'd like to introduce you to the owner." Tom allegedly complained to the label, and it was claimed that he wanted Epic Records to pull the support for the album, a charge that he now denies. Goudreau would end up leaving Boston in 1981, with Scholz claiming they ended their relationship on good terms during an interview with Third Stage. The next fight Scholz had to face was with Epic Records and their parent company CBS, who were eager for a third record. With years having passed since Don't Look Back was released, the label devised a plan to withhold royalty payments to Scholz to force his hand to release an album sooner rather than later. The plan failed, and with no other options, Epic's parent company CBS would file a lawsuit against Scholz, citing a breach of contract in 1984, claiming that the guitarist was, and I quote, "uncooperative." In turn, Scholz retaliated with his own lawsuit over unpaid royalty payments, and Scholz would win both cases despite the fact that the litigation would last for over half a decade and slowed the progress of a third record. It was during this time Scholz signed a new record deal with MCA, but CBS was pretty vengeful and ended up suing MCA, issuing a cease and desist order, and they wanted a huge advance, claiming that for every album Scholz sold on any future Boston releases, CBS should get 25 cents. His old label would end up losing their case in 1985, and Scholz was now a free man. During the litigation, Scholz also founded a music research and development company in 1982 called Scholz Research and Development, which made amplifiers and other musical electronic equipment. With record label lawsuits behind him, Scholz was finally able to finish up work on Boston's third album. Scholz would bring back vocalist Brad Delp, as well as drummer Jim Mesdia, who helped him on the original Boston demo, and also joining him was former Sammy Hagar guitarist Gary Pill, who also helped Scholz with his research and development company by acting as an executive. The resulting album would be 1986's Third Stage, which was a quasi-concept record that explored the several stages of life from infancy to adulthood. Compared to the band's first two records, represented a more subdued sound, while still featuring a few songs that harken back to the late 70s. Despite the long gaps between the records, the album still went platinum, selling over 4 million units. Following the release of Third Stage, the band hit the road for 2 years supporting the album, and they would play Third Stage from start to finish during live shows. As the 90s rolled in, Boston turned their attention to their new album, but much like the rest of their career, things never went easy. Tom Scholz was surprised when singer Brad Delp left the band and joined former guitarist Brad Goudreau's new band at the time, RTZ. And just like that, the recognizable voice of Boston was gone, leaving Scholz as the only original member. Prior to his departure, Brad Delp did help co-write a song that would be titled Walk On, which would become the title track of Boston's next album. Needing a new singer, Scholz looked closer to home than getting a complete outsider when he enlisted former Iron the Hunter singer Frank Cosmo, who played on Barry Goudreau's solo record. The next Boston album, titled Walk On, would be released in 1994, and there would be elements of the band's 3 previous records sprinkled throughout the album. The record, though, failed to be a top 5 hit, peaking at number 7, but it still went platinum and produced the single I Need Your Love. As the band got ready to hit the road to support the record, vocalist Brad Delp rejoined the group. With 2 singers in the band, Delp shared vocal duties with new singer Fran Cosmo. Now, looking back at Boston's career, 8 appears to be the magic number, as the band would take another 8 years to release their follow-up album, 2002's Corporate America. The marketing strategy behind Corporate America was a bit different than their previous records, as Boston was no longer on a big label, and Scholz would upload the album to mp3.com under the moniker Downer's Revenge instead of Boston. Waiting 8 years between releases meant there was a seismic shift in rock and roll as trends came and went, and Scholz was worried that if the album had the Boston name on it, some people wouldn't have bothered to give the record a chance. Corporate America would be released on the now-defunct indie label Artemis, which was headed by Danny Goldberg, who used to be Nirvana's longtime manager. The record featured the largest lineup of Boston to date, with Cosmo and Delp both singing on the album, but Corporate America would fall on deaf ears and didn't even chart in the top 40. But that didn't stop the band from touring for several years on the album. And Scholz's business relationship with Artemis Records would be short-lived, as he would turn around and sue the label for $4 million for, as he claimed, inadequately promoting the album, despite repeated promises from the label that the record would be the company's highest priority. Fast forward to March of 2007, Boston fans were shocked to learn that the voice of the band, Brad Delp, had taken his life in his home in New Hampshire. Rather than coming together in the aftermath of his death, a lot of people started pointing fingers, more specifically at Tom Scholz. Scholz was accused of running his band with an iron fist, with little regard for how his bandmates felt, with some claiming that it made Delp feel marginalized. Scholz would defend himself, claiming Delp was free to come and go in the band, and that he did. Things got especially ugly when Delp's widow gave an interview to the Boston Herald, where she insinuated that Scholz was responsible for her husband's death. This resulted in Scholz suing the widow, as well as the newspaper, for running a defamatory story and causing emotional distress. Following his death, the members of Boston would hold a tribute concert to Delp titled Come Together, a tribute to Brad Delp. And in 2013, Boston released their 6th album, Life, Love, and Hope, which featured lead vocals from Brad Delp among many other singers. The album sessions dated back to 2002, and in the subsequent years, Scholz has continued to tour under the Boston name, and it was reported in 2018 that some of the band's master recordings were destroyed in the Universal Music Fire. During an interview with the Third Stage website, Tom Scholz was asked, "Has anyone ever told you that you're too damn smart for your own good?" To which he would respond, "I used to be very smart, but I am not that smart anymore. I'm just right now," he'd say. So that does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like button and subscribe. If you guys have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comment section below. Take care.